The phone rang just as the late autumn sun slipped through the blinds, cutting golden stripes across my kitchen table. I had been sitting there with my morning coffee, half reading the paper, half listening to the familiar hum of the old refrigerator. When I picked up the receiver, I didn't expect my son's voice to sound so casual, as though he were asking me to check the mailbox or water his plants. "Dad, Melissa and I talked. Starting next week, you'll be watching Clara and Jacob full time. It just makes sense. You're retired, you've got the time, and the kids love you." Before we continue, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell icon, so you never miss a story like this one. His words landed with the weight of a stone dropped in still water. I stared at the chipped edge of my mug, letting the silence stretch longer than usual. Daniel didn't notice. He never did. My son spoke as if my life were a blank slate, waiting for him to fill it in. I swallowed the knot forming in my throat. "Full time?" I asked slowly. "You mean every day?" "Of course," he said. "Melissa and I are swamped with work, and daycare is too expensive. You're the obvious choice. Besides, Mom always said family takes care of family." The mention of Marjorie, my late wife, was a knife turned slowly. She had been gone for nearly 10 years, but Daniel wielded her memory like a tool whenever it suited him. He forgot that she had dreams of her own, ones that had never seen the light of day because she, like me, always put everyone else first. I set the mug down carefully, though my hand trembled. The kitchen around me, with its worn linoleum, the clock that ticked too loudly, the photographs of my children when they were small, felt suddenly claustrophobic. Daniel kept talking, outlining the new plan. "We'll drop them off around 8 in the morning, pick them up after 6. Sometimes later if Melissa has meetings. Weekends too, when we need a break. They're good kids, Dad. You'll love it. Think of it as your new purpose. As if my decades of nursing shifts, sleepless nights, and sacrifices were meaningless until I became his unpaid babysitter." I remembered my wife's voice, soft and determined, urging me to pick up a paintbrush in those rare, quiet evenings. "Luke," she'd said, "someday you'll have the time to paint again." That someday had never come. I pressed my palm flat against the table to steady myself. "Daniel," I said, "have you thought about what this means for me?" He chuckled lightly, mistaking my hesitation for reluctance. "It means you'll finally have company every day. No more lonely house. The kids adore you. And honestly, Dad, what else do you have to do?" The words cut deeper than he knew. What else did I have to do? Was my life, at 68, reduced to being available? A vessel of time, to be poured into his convenience? I wanted to remind him of the years I'd spent paying his tuition, covering his rent, loaning him money that was never repaid. I wanted to tell him how I sold Marjorie's old engagement ring to help with his down payment, how I'd skipped fixing the leaking roof so he and Melissa could go on their honeymoon. But instead, I just listened as he laid out his schedule, as though my consent were already given. "Dad, it'll be perfect," Daniel concluded. "Melissa will bring over snacks and diapers. You just keep them entertained, fed, safe. Piece of cake. He had no idea. The call ended with a quick, "Thanks, Dad." "We owe you one," before the line went dead. My hand lingered on the receiver, heavy as if glued in place. The house was silent again, but it was a silence filled with echoes. Every past favor, every sacrifice, every time I had told myself, "It's just this once." I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me. The sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor, and for the first time in years, I felt something fracture inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was recognition. Recognition that my son saw me not as Luke Carter, man, widower, nurse, someone who once had his own ambitions, but as a function, a free pair of hands, a convenient solution. My eyes drifted to the corner of the living room, where Marjorie's easel still stood, folded, dusty, untouched. I hadn't painted since before she died. Life, bills, responsibilities. They had all crowded out that piece of me. Now Daniel's voice echoed in my head. What else do you have to do? I closed my eyes. Maybe the better question was, what have I never allowed myself to do? I couldn't shake Daniel's words. They followed me like shadows as I moved through the house that day. Every corner held reminders of the life I had lived, a life that had been poured out, piece by piece, into everyone else's cup while mine stayed empty. I wandered into the hallway where old photographs lined the walls. There was Daniel at 5 years old, grinning with 2 missing teeth, his hair sticking up from the summer heat. Next to it, a picture of Marjorie holding him on her hip, her smile soft but weary, already etched with the marks of endless nights. And there I was, in my nurse's scrubs, looking younger, stronger, but carrying the same tired eyes I saw in the mirror this morning. People used to tell me I had the heart of a saint, that only someone with boundless patience could work the night shifts, clean wounds, comfort the dying, and then come home to raise a child. But the truth was less noble. I did it because I had to. After Marjorie's sudden illness and long recovery, the bills didn't stop arriving. The mortgage, the insurance, the endless doctor's visits, all of it rested on my shoulders. I worked double shifts, sometimes 70 hours a week, until my knees ached and my back screamed for rest. I still remember the metallic tang of hospital disinfectant clinging to my skin, the sting of latex gloves after hours of wear, the sound of monitors beeping like a constant reminder of how fragile life really was. I gave my best years to strangers, to families who wept with gratitude as I held their loved ones' hands. And when I came home, I gave the rest of me to Daniel. There was a time I thought it was worth it. Seeing him in his school uniform, hair neatly combed, shoes polished, I told myself that all the exhaustion, all the sacrifices, were justified. I was building a future for him, for us. But somewhere along the way, the sacrifices became invisible. The nights I skipped meals so he could have new cleats for soccer. The weekends I spent fixing his car while my own sat rusting in the driveway. The college tuition checks that drained our savings account. I wrote them without hesitation. And when he struggled to find his footing as an adult, I opened my wallet again and again. Rent money, down payments, vacations he couldn't afford but insisted Melissa needed for her mental health. I can still picture the night I handed him the envelope with Marjorie's engagement ring tucked inside. Pawn it, I said softly. Use it for your car, Daniel. You need to get to work somehow. He had hugged me quickly, distracted, already planning how to spend the money. I never saw the ring again. Even now I can hear Marjorie's voice in the quiet of the house. Luke, don't lose yourself. She used to say that when I came home too tired to speak, when I pushed aside the half-finished painting she had set out for me on the kitchen table. She wanted me to remember that I was more than a nurse, more than a father. I was a man with dreams, but dreams are fragile things. They're easy to set aside when bills stack up and a child depends on you. And when Marjorie passed, I buried the last of them with her. I ran my hand over the worn banister as I climbed the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, carrying me back through the years. I remembered Daniel's first heartbreak, how I stayed up with him in silence because he didn't want advice, only presence. I remembered the way Marjorie and I had argued quietly in the kitchen after his reckless choices. The credit card debt, the jobs he couldn't hold, the way he leaned on us as if it were a birthright. And yet, I never said no. No was a word I reserved for myself. No, Luke, you can't buy new shoes. No, Luke, you can't take a vacation. No, Luke, you can't paint tonight because you're too tired and someone else needs you. As I reached the top of the stairs, I opened the door to the small spare room, the one Daniel still referred to as his room, even though he hadn't lived here in over a decade. The posters were faded, the shelves cluttered with trophies he never came back to claim. I stood there, staring at the dust-covered relics, and felt something tighten in my chest. All these years I had mistaken sacrifice for love. I thought the more I gave, the more he would see me, respect me, value me. But the truth stared back at me in every unpaid debt, every forgotten thank you. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the memories crash over me. The nights I stayed at the hospital longer than scheduled, so he wouldn't come home to an empty house. The times I lied to Marjorie, telling her I was fine, when in truth my spirit was worn thin. The way I silenced my own needs so thoroughly that Daniel grew up believing I didn't have any. That's what his call had revealed. It wasn't just about babysitting. It was about a lifetime of assuming my existence belonged to him. And maybe, in some twisted way, I had taught him to think that. The realization cut deep, but it also lit something inside me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to wonder, what if I stopped? What if I said no? The thought was terrifying, but it was also intoxicating. Downstairs, the clock struck noon. I sat there, frozen in the dust of old posters and broken trophies, staring at the life I had built. A life that had never really belonged to me. And I knew in that moment that Daniel's demand wasn't just unreasonable. It was the final straw in a lifetime of sacrifices that had already cost me too much. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, and in the silence, Daniel's words echoed louder than ever. What else do you have to do? He'd said it so casually, so thoughtlessly, as if my life were just empty space, waiting to be filled with their needs. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the familiar creak of the beams above me sounding like a clock ticking away the years I'd given up. I turned on my side, then on my back, but rest refused to come. Finally, sometime after midnight, I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and padded down the hallway in my slippers. The air was cool, heavy with that faint, musty smell old houses seem to carry no matter how often you open the windows. I went to the small oak dresser in my study, the one with the sticky drawer that always fought me when I tried to open it. With a grunt, I tugged it free. Inside lay the notebooks I had kept for years. It wasn't that I didn't trust my own memory. It was habit, the kind of habit you develop when every cent matters. During my years as a nurse, I learned quickly that the paycheck I brought home had to stretch further than it had any right to. Marjorie had done the same in her own quiet way. Together, we wrote down every expense, every payment, every borrowed dime. I carried one of those notebooks to the kitchen table and set it down like a relic. Its cover was worn smooth, the corners bent, the pages yellowed. My hands trembled as I flipped it open. The entries leapt out at me, each line a reminder of something I had given away. Without hesitation. Daniel's tuition, $12,500. Car repairs, $1,800. Down payment loan, $5,000 honeymoon contribution, $2,000 rent help during layoff, $3,600 credit card debt bailout, $4,200. The numbers blurred together. I rubbed my eyes, but the totals only grew crueler the longer I stared at them. And those were just the big items. There were smaller ones scattered everywhere. Birthday dinners, $300, $450, $600. Christmas gifts, $900. Utilities loan, $200, $350. Miscellaneous emergencies, $150 here, $400 there. Each page was proof, written in my own hand, of a life where my generosity had been endless, but my recognition scarce. I sat back in my chair and let the numbers settle like stones in my stomach. I'd given away not just money, but security. The leaky roof I'd postponed fixing, the old car I still drove because Daniel needed a newer one, the medications I sometimes delayed buying because there was always something more urgent. I had convinced myself it was normal. Isn't that what parents do? Sacrifice, give, adjust? But staring at those pages, I realized I hadn't been a parent for years. I had been a bank. What stung most wasn't the money itself. Money, after all, comes and goes. What hurt was the ease with which Daniel and Melissa had come to expect it. No questions, no gratitude, just assumption. I remembered the first time it had really hit me. When Daniel called, his voice rushed and impatient. "Dad, can you cover our rent just this once? We'll pay you back next month, I promise." Next month never came. Instead came another call, and I kept saying yes. Somewhere along the line, just this once had turned into as always. I flipped further back in the notebook, my eyes catching on an entry I had tried hard to forget. Pawned Marjorie's ring, $2,800. I traced the ink with my fingertip, the numbers trembling as if they might vanish if I touched them too hard. That ring was the last piece of her I had left. I'd told myself it was just a thing, that memories were what mattered. But the truth was, handing over that ring had felt like burying her all over again. And what had Daniel done with the money? Paid off a loan he should never have taken in the first place. There had been no shame in his voice when he asked, only expectation. I closed the notebook and pressed both palms against the cover, as though I could shut out the truth it contained. But the numbers lived in my bones now, rattling around like loose change in an empty pocket. Leaning back, I stared at the ceiling. I thought about all the years I had convinced myself that giving was the same as loving, that if I gave enough, Daniel would understand my sacrifices, respect them, honor them. Instead, he had grown to see them as normal, as owed. A quiet laugh escaped me, bitter and sharp. I had spent my life saving others, patients, family, my own child, but who had ever saved me? The clock on the wall ticked past 1 in the morning. I closed the notebook and set it aside, but the weight of it remained heavy on the table, heavy on me. For the first time in a long time, I let myself whisper the truth aloud. This debt never ends. Not because the bills kept coming, but because I kept paying, with money, with time, with pieces of myself. And if I didn't stop soon, there wouldn't be anything left of Luke Carter. The next morning, I lingered longer than usual in bed. Sunlight seeped through the curtains, painting the room in a pale gold that reminded me of another time, another life. For a moment, half dreaming, I expected to hear her voice from the kitchen, humming as she made coffee. But when I turned my head, the other side of the bed was empty, had been empty for nearly a decade. Marjorie. Her name drifted through me like a prayer and a wound all at once. I sat up slowly, feeling the old ache in my knees. The house was quiet, too quiet. I padded across the floor, my slippers brushing against the worn wood, and found myself drawn to the small cedar chest at the foot of the bed. I hadn't opened it in years. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, the faint scent of lavender sachets rising like a ghost. Inside were the fragments of a life we had built together. A faded wedding photo, her favorite scarf with a snagged edge, a stack of letters tied with ribbon. Beneath them all lay a sketchbook, its cover cracked, the paper yellowed. My breath caught as I lifted it out. Marjorie had given it to me on my 35th birthday, back when I still had calluses on my fingers from holding a brush instead of syringes. She had written on the inside cover in her looping hand, "For Luke, who sees the world in colors the rest of us miss." Don't ever stop painting. I traced the letters with my fingertip, my throat tightening. I remembered the night she gave it to me. We had just put Daniel to bed after one of his tantrums, and I had collapsed onto the couch, exhausted from a 12-hour hospital shift. She placed the book in my lap with that smile of hers, the one that seemed to hold the whole world steady. "Luke," she said softly, "don't let your work take everything from you. Save some of yourself for this." She tapped the sketchbook, then tapped my chest. "For you." But I hadn't listened. There was always one more shift to pick up, one more bill to pay, one more problem to solve. And she, selfless, patient Marjorie never pressed me. She would simply leave my brushes out on the kitchen table, waiting like a child hoping her father would come home. Some nights I used them, many more I did not. When her illness came, it was sudden and cruel, a disease that moved too fast, leaving us gasping for air. I cared for her the way I had cared for countless patients, but this time my hands shook. I prayed my training would be enough. It wasn't. I still remember last night, the way she held my hand and whispered, "Promise me you won't lose yourself, Luke. Promise me you'll still live," I promised. And then she was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel was grown by then, starting his own life, and I found myself alone in a house that felt too big, too empty. I told myself I'd honor her memory by being strong, by being useful. When Daniel called needing help, rent, car payments, babysitting, I said yes. It made me feel like I still had purpose, like I hadn't broken my promise to her. But sitting there with that sketchbook in my lap, I realized I had done the opposite. I hadn't lived. I had buried myself in service to others, mistaking duty for life, mistaking sacrifice for love. I turned the pages, each one filled with half-finished sketches. The outline of our garden, a portrait of Daniel as a boy, a street corner from our neighborhood. None of them completed. They stared back at me like accusations. My eyes burned. I pressed the book closed and held it against my chest. "I'm sorry, Marjorie," I whispered unto the stillness. "I lost myself anyway." I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the maple tree we planted the year Daniel was born stretched its limbs toward the sky. Its leaves had turned a deep crimson, fluttering like fire in the crisp air. Marjorie loved that tree. She used to sit under it with a book, her hair catching the light. I could almost see her there still, a ghost of memory too real to dismiss. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass and let the tears come. They weren't the wild sobs of fresh grief. They were slow, steady, years delayed. Tears for the dreams I had buried alongside her, for the man she had loved who had vanished into duty and debt. After a while, I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The house was still silent, but something inside me had shifted. For the first time in years, I admitted the truth. I didn't just miss Marjorie. I missed the version of myself who existed when she was alive. The man who believed he could create beauty, not just patch wounds. And maybe, just maybe, that man wasn't gone forever. I closed the chest and carried the sketchbook with me down the stairs. I set it gently on the kitchen table, beside the old notebook of debts. 2 books, side by side. One filled with all I had given away, the other with all I had abandoned. One represented the life that had drained me, the other the life I had yet to reclaim. And for the first time, I wondered if it wasn't too late to choose differently. I carried Marjorie's sketchbook with me for days after I pulled it from the cedar chest. It sat on the kitchen table, beside the notebook of debts, like 2 witnesses waiting to testify against me. Every time I walked past, I felt their weight. One held proof of everything I'd given away, the other proof of everything I'd let slip through my fingers. And as I moved through the rooms of this old house, I started to see the past, not as I had remembered it, but as it really was. The memories came like flashes, sharp, stinging, uninvited. I remembered a dinner years ago when Daniel and Melissa first brought Clara over as a baby. I had spent the whole afternoon preparing a roast, setting the table, polishing the silver Marjorie and I had saved up for, back when we believed in building traditions. Melissa took one bite and said lightly, "It's good, Luke, but I think my mother makes her roast juicier." Daniel chuckled in agreement, as if I hadn't been the one standing over a hot oven for hours. I laughed it off at the time, but the truth is it felt like being slapped. Another memory. Daniel calling me after work, his tone brisk. "Dad, can you drive across town to pick up Clara from daycare?" Melissa and I are both stuck at the office. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital. my back screaming, my feet swollen inside my shoes. I told him I was tired, that maybe they could ask a neighbor. Silence, then a sigh, then, "Fine, Dad, I'll figure it out. Just forget it." The guilt ate at me until I grabbed my keys anyway. When I arrived, Melissa was already there, standing with her phone in hand. "Oh, you didn't have to come," she said flatly, not even looking up, or the time Clara's birthday party was hosted in my backyard, because their apartment was too small. I mowed the lawn, strung up decorations, even rented a bouncy castle at my own expense. I stood off to the side, watching children laugh, waiting for a simple thank you. Instead, Melissa announced to the crowd that she and Daniel had worked so hard to put together such a special day. My contribution was invisible, as always. The humiliations weren't always loud. Sometimes they were small, almost casual, but they cut deeper than any outright insult. I remember being at Melissa's family's Thanksgiving one year. I had brought a homemade pie, apple, the recipe Marjorie perfected, hoping to honor her memory. When dessert time came, my pie sat untouched at the far end of the table while Melissa's mother's store-bought pumpkin pie was passed around twice. Not a soul asked about mine. At the end of the night, I carried it back home, still whole, as though Marjorie's memory had been rejected alongside it. And then there was the Christmas when Daniel promised to stop by early to help me carry the boxes of decorations down from the attic. I waited all morning. He never showed. When he finally arrived in the afternoon with Melissa, he waved his hand and said, "Sorry, Dad, got busy. But at least you got it all set up." He didn't notice my sore back, didn't see the sweat on my brow from climbing up and down the attic ladder alone. These moments piled up like snow on a roof, each flake light on its own, but together enough to crush the beams beneath it. I used to tell myself not to take it, personally, that they were busy, distracted, young, that I was reading too much into things. But the truth is, each time they dismissed me, each time they overlooked what I gave, it chipped away at something essential. I found myself thinking back even further to the hospital years. I remembered colleagues taking advantage of me, too, asking me to cover their shifts because Luke's dependable. And I always said yes. Dependable became another word for disposable. Marjorie had seen it. She used to tell me gently, "Luke, you can't keep giving until there's nothing left." And I would laugh it off, thinking I was strong enough to carry it all. But she was right. As the memories crowded in, I realized something with painful clarity. I had been humiliated so often that I stopped noticing. I had let myself believe invisibility was normal, that as long as I kept saying yes, I still had value. I sat in the living room that evening, the sketchbook open on my lap, a pencil in my hand. My fingers itched to draw, but I couldn't. Instead, I scribbled words in the margins. Words I'd never dared to say aloud. Tired. Used. Invisible. The page blurred as tears welled in my eyes. I wasn't crying just for the roast that went unappreciated, the pie left untouched, the decorations carried alone. I was crying because those small humiliations had become the story of my life. A story where I existed only in the shadows of other people's needs. But beneath the shame, something else stirred. Anger, raw and unfamiliar, after years of suppression. How many more times would I let myself be diminished? How many more years would I allow their sighs, their dismissals, their casual cruelties to define me? I closed the sketchbook with a snap and set it down on the table. My chest heaved as I leaned back in the chair. The air felt different, sharper. For the first time, I wasn't just mourning the past. I was starting to reckon with it. And deep inside, a thought whispered, "It doesn't have to be this way anymore." The phone rang again the next afternoon. I didn't even have to look at the caller ID to know it was Daniel. My hand hovered over the receiver, heart pounding, a familiar wave of dread rolling through me. Answering his calls had become reflex, like a soldier saluting without thinking. But this time, something in me hesitated. I picked up slowly, pressing the phone to my ear. "Dad," Daniel began without so much as a hello, "Melissa's got a big presentation tomorrow, and I'll be out late at the office. We'll drop the kids off tonight and pick them up after work tomorrow. It'll just be easier if they sleep over at your place. You don't mind, right?" It wasn't a question. It was an announcement, delivered in that brisk, entitled tone of his, the one that assumed my time, my house, my life belonged to him. I sat in silence, gripping the receiver, feeling the old ache in my chest flare again. My mouth was dry, but words finally scraped out. "Daniel, did you even ask me if I was free?" He laughed lightly, as though I'd cracked a joke. "Dad, you're retired. You're always free. Besides, the kids love it at your place. They'll have more fun with you anyway." Those words, "you're always free," hit me like a hammer. Always free, as if my life had no weight, no shape, no worth beyond availability. I looked across the room at the two books still sitting on my kitchen table. The notebook of debts, the sketchbook of abandoned dreams. They seemed to glare at me, demanding an answer I had avoided for decades. I pressed the receiver tighter to my ear. "Daniel," I said slowly, "I can't do it." For a moment there was silence on the other end, so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then came his incredulous laugh. "What do you mean you can't? Dad, come on, it's just overnight. You've done this before." "I said I can't," I repeated, my voice firmer now, steadier than I felt. "Not this time." "Not anymore." There was a pause, then irritation edged into his voice. "Dad, don't start acting difficult. You know we rely on you. We don't have other options." I closed my eyes, memories flooding me, Marjorie's final plea that I not lose myself, the years of small humiliations, the endless debts scribbled in ink. My whole life condensed into this one moment, this one choice. "You'll have to find another option," I said. The silence stretched again, this time longer, darker. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was sharper, colder. "Are you serious right now? You're just going to let us down? Let your grandchildren down?" The guilt clawed at me immediately. Clara's smile, Jacob's laughter. They had no part in this. They were innocent, and I loved them. But love didn't mean slavery, and for once I refused to let guilt chain me back into silence. "I love Clara and Jacob," I said softly, "but I am not your solution anymore. I won't keep giving up my life so you can have yours without consequence." His voice rose. "Unbelievable. Melissa was right. You're getting selfish in your old age. Mom would have never done this that cut deep." Marjorie invoked again like a weapon. For years her memory had been used to manipulate me, to remind me of the standard I could never question. But this time, instead of bowing beneath it, I felt something ignite. "Don't you dare bring your mother into this," I snapped, my voice sharper than it had been in years. "She gave everything she had for you. And so have I. But she asked me to keep living after she was gone, not to keep sacrificing until there's nothing left. I will not let you turn me into a shell of a man just because it's convenient for you." There was a stunned silence on the line. I imagined Daniel blinking, mouth opening and closing like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. "Dad," he said finally, his voice lower, almost dangerous, "if you don't help us, you'll regret it. We won't forget this." The threat hung in the air. Once it would have terrified me, the idea of losing his approval, of being cast out of his life. But now it only clarified the truth. I had already been living without his respect. I exhaled slowly. If you can only love me when I say yes, then it isn't love at all. Before he could respond, I set the receiver back in its cradle with trembling hands. My knees felt weak, my chest tight, but under it all was something new, something fierce and unfamiliar. Relief. For the first time in decades, I had said no. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the phone as though it were some strange relic. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive. It pulsed with possibility. I walked to the window and looked out at the maple tree in the yard. its crimson leaves glowing against the pale sky. For years I had thought of it as a symbol of time passing, each leaf a reminder of things lost. But in that moment, it looked different. It looked like fire, like renewal. I placed my hand flat against the glass and whispered, "Marjorie, I finally did it." And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was breaking. I felt like I was beginning. The house was still trembling with the echo of what I had done. Saying no to Daniel had left me shaky, my chest heavy with adrenaline. But underneath the storm in my body, there was a quiet, undeniable calm. For once, I hadn't folded. For once, I hadn't let guilt override my own sanity. I sat down at the kitchen table again. The 2 books were still there, waiting, my notebook of debts and Marjorie's sketchbook. They looked almost accusatory, side by side, like mirrors showing me who I had been and who I might still become. I reached for the notebook first. The cover was frayed, the corners bent, pages swollen slightly from years of handling. I flipped it open and stared at the columns of numbers, my own handwriting staring back like an unflinching witness. Every loan, every gift, every just this once. $200 for Daniel's textbooks. $1,500 for the used car he swore he'd pay me back for. $3,600 to cover their rent when Melissa lost her job. $2,000 for their honeymoon because everyone deserves a start. $800 when their refrigerator broke. $450 when Melissa won a new laptop for work. $2,800 from pawning Marjorie's engagement ring. And that wasn't even counting the countless dinners, holidays, babysitting hours, unpaid utilities, or the quiet sacrifices that never made it into ink. I started tallying, line by line, my pencil scratching across the page. My hand trembled as the total grew higher, climbing like a cruel mountain I hadn't realized I'd been scaling. When I reached the bottom, I set the pencil down and stared. Over $20,000. $20,000. Gone. Taken from my pension, from the savings I had built with Marjorie, from the nest egg meant to carry me into the years when my hands would be too shaky to work and my body too tired to stand. But it wasn't just money. It was time, energy, pieces of myself. I thought about the vacations I never took, the roof I still hadn't fixed, the medical checkups I skipped because I didn't want to spend the money. I thought about the trips Marjorie and I used to dream of. Italy, Spain, the Grand Canyon, all postponed, all sacrificed. And for what? The tears burned hot in my eyes. I wasn't angry at the money. I was angry at myself for letting it happen, for being so desperate to prove love that I mistook servitude for devotion. I closed the notebook with a heavy thud. It felt like dropping a gavel, the verdict rendered. I had been complicit in my own erasure. I sat there staring at the closed cover, when a thought struck me like lightning. If I can write down everything I've given away, maybe I can start writing down what I will no longer give. The idea terrified me and thrilled me all at once. I pulled the notebook back toward me and turned to a blank page. My pencil hovered over the paper before I finally pressed down, carving letters into the fiber. Things I will no longer sacrifice. My hand shook, but I kept writing. My time, my home, my savings, my health, my dreams. I stared at the list. 5 simple lines, but they felt heavier than the $20,000 on the previous pages. Because for the first time, I wasn't documenting loss. I was declaring boundaries. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling shakily. The maple tree outside my window rustled in the wind, its crimson leaves scattering like embers. For years I had thought I was preserving my family by saying yes. But what kind of preservation was it if I was crumbling in the process? My phone buzzed on the counter, startling me. A message from Daniel lit the screen. "Dad, I don't understand what's gotten into you. Melissa says you're being dramatic. Can we just forget this? We'll bring the kids tomorrow like we planned." I stared at the words, the entitlement dripping from each one. Forget this. As if decades of exploitation could be erased like chalk on a blackboard. For a moment, I almost replied. Old reflexes urged me to smooth things over, to explain, to apologize. But then my eyes flicked back to the notebook. My time, my home, my savings, my health, my dreams. Instead of answering, I turned the phone face down and let it buzz into silence. I picked up Marjorie's sketchbook next, running my hand across the cracked cover. Opening it, I saw again the unfinished drawings, the smudged pencil lines, the outlines waiting to be filled with color. They felt like promises I had made to myself and never kept. The thought came to me suddenly, clear and insistent. What if I used the money I had wasted on others to finally invest in myself? What if instead of paying for someone else's rent, I paid for canvas and paints? What if instead of sacrificing for a life that drained me, I built one that gave me back pieces of who I was? The idea scared me because it meant change, real change. But as I sat there with both notebooks open before me, I realized I was standing on a threshold. On one side was the life I had always known, endless giving, endless erasure. On the other side was something terrifyingly unfamiliar, freedom. And for the first time in decades, I wanted to step across. The morning after I wrote my list, things I will no longer sacrifice, I sat at the kitchen table staring at it again. The words looked almost foreign, as though someone else had written them. My time, my home, my savings, my health, my dreams. 5 lines that felt like a wall built around something fragile I had only just discovered inside myself. For hours I circled those words with my eyes, waiting for the familiar wave of guilt to drown me, waiting for the voice in my head, Daniel's voice, Melissa's voice, sometimes even my own, to tell me I was being selfish. But the guilt never came. Or maybe it tried to, and for once I didn't let it in. Instead, another voice rose, quieter but stronger. Marjorie's. Promise me you won't lose yourself, Luke. Promise me you'll still live. I pressed my palm against the page, as though holding her words down to keep them from floating away. Then I reached for her sketchbook. Its cracked cover felt warmer now, more alive. I flipped through the unfinished drawings again. The garden, Daniel's boyish grin, the street corner we used to walk after dinner. Each page whispered of who I had been, who I might still be if I had the courage to reach for it. That's when the thought came, bold and terrifying. What if I opened a gallery? The idea burst into my mind so suddenly I almost laughed. Me, 68 years old, with stiff knees and shaky hands, opening a gallery. The notion felt absurd, a child's daydream. And yet, the longer I sat with it, the more it took root. A gallery wasn't just a business. It was a space to honor Marjorie's memory. She had always wanted me to show my art, to share it with others. I had buried that dream with her, but maybe, just maybe, I could dig it out again. The thought frightened me. My savings weren't endless. Daniel had already chipped away at them for years. But the money I had left, wasn't it better spent on something that gave me life, rather than drained it? I stood suddenly, my chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the hallway closet. Buried under old coats and a stack of forgotten shoeboxes was a canvas I hadn't touched in over a decade. I pulled it out, coughing at the cloud of dust it stirred. The painting was half finished, a landscape of the maple tree in autumn, its leaves bright with fire. My throat tightened. Marjorie had loved that tree. She used to sit beneath it with her books, her hair glowing in the afternoon sun. I had tried to capture it once, long ago, but I had stopped midway, too tired, too distracted, too busy saying yes to everyone else. Now, staring at that unfinished canvas, I felt something stirring in my chest. Not anger, not grief. Something else. Hope, maybe. I carried the painting to the kitchen table and set it beside the notebooks. 3 artifacts of my life. Debts, dreams abandoned, dreams unfinished. I sat down, picked up a pencil, and scribbled a new line under my list. Open a gallery. The words looked impossible, and yet they looked true. I didn't know the first thing about opening a gallery, but I knew about work. I knew about dedication. I had given my life to patience, to family, to endless demands. Surely I could give that same dedication to myself, even if it terrified me. Later that afternoon, I took my first step. I walked downtown, past the hardware store, the library, the cafe where I used to sit with Marjorie. My knees ached with each block, but I kept going. I stopped outside a vacant storefront with dusty windows and a for lease sign taped crookedly on the glass. I stood there a long time, peering in at the empty space. The floor was scuffed, the walls yellowed, but I could almost see it filled with paintings, light streaming through clean windows, Marjorie's sketch of the garden on one wall, my maple tree on another, maybe even other local artists, people who had buried their own dreams and needed a place to resurrect them. My reflection in the glass startled me. I looked older than I felt in that moment. The lines around my eyes, the silver in my beard, all marks of years I had spent giving, never taking. But behind my reflection was the space, blank and waiting. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number on the sign before I could lose my nerve. My voice trembled when the leasing agent answered. Yes, I said, clearing my throat. I'm calling about the space on Main Street. I'd like to schedule a viewing. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. I leaned against the cold glass, breath fogging in front of me. Fear swirled in my gut, but so did something else. Exhilaration. I had no guarantee this would work. Maybe I was too old, too inexperienced, too foolish. But for the first time in decades, the risk was mine to take. Not for Daniel, not for Melissa, not for anyone but me. As I walked home, the wind rustled through the trees, scattering crimson leaves across the sidewalk. I bent to pick one up, holding it in my hand. Its edges were crisp, its color brilliant. I tucked it into Marjorie's sketchbook when I got home. A sign, maybe, of something beginning. I placed the sketchbook back on the table, beside the notebook of debts. The two looked different now, not just reminders of what I had lost, but guides to what I might gain. And as I sat there in the fading afternoon light, I whispered, aloud, more to myself than anyone else, I'm going to do it. I'm opening a gallery. The words hung in the air, fragile but alive. For the first time in years, I felt like I had chosen something for myself. The next morning, I knew I couldn't avoid it. Daniel would call, or Melissa would, and they'd want answers. I had taken the step. I'd scheduled a viewing for the empty storefront downtown. But my decision didn't live in isolation. Not anymore. Sure enough, around mid-morning, the phone rang. This time it wasn't Daniel. It was Melissa. Her voice was sharp before I even said hello. Luke, what's this I hear about you refusing to take the kids? Daniel came home furious last night. He said you... She paused, the word dripping with disdain. Snapped at him. That you told him you wouldn't help anymore. Please tell me he misunderstood. I held the receiver to my ear, staring out the window at the maple tree, its branches bare now, its leaves scattered on the ground like a carpet of fire. I took a breath. He didn't misunderstand. I told him the truth. I can't keep doing it. Her scoff rang sharp in my ear. Unbelievable! Do you know what this does to us? To your grandchildren? Daniel works himself to the bone. I have deadlines. We counted on you. And you're just... what? Deciding you're done? Yes, I said quietly. The word felt solid, like a stone I could stand on. There was a beat of silence, then Melissa's voice rose. This is selfish, Luke. Plain selfish. After everything Daniel has done for you. That line almost made me laugh, bitter and humorless. Everything Daniel had done for me? My mind flashed to the pages of my notebook, the endless list of numbers, the pawned ring, the unpaid debts. I swallowed hard. Melissa, I said evenly, I've given more than you know, more than Daniel remembers, and now I'm giving something to myself, To yourself? She snapped. At your age? What could you possibly need? The question stung, not because I didn't have an answer, but because it revealed exactly how they saw me. As finished, spent, an old man with nothing left but service. I need my life back, I said softly. The line went silent. For a moment I thought she'd hung up, but then her voice returned, low and cutting. Daniel was right. You've changed. This isn't you. Your wife would never forgive you for abandoning family like this. That one pierced deep. I closed my eyes, picturing Marjorie's face, but instead of crumbling, I heard her voice. Not Melissa's twisted version, but the real one. Promise me you'll still live. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised me with its strength. Melissa, don't speak for my wife. She knew me better than anyone, and she wouldn't want me erased. Melissa inhaled sharply, then spat. Fine. Do whatever you want, but don't expect us to pick up the pieces when you realize how foolish this is. She hung up before I could respond. I set the receiver down, my hand trembling. My knees felt weak, but I stayed standing, staring at the phone as if it might ring again. It didn't take long. An hour later, Daniel showed up at my front door. He didn't knock softly. He pounded, each blow shaking the wood. When I opened it, his face was flushed, his jaw tight. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Dad, what the hell are you doing? He demanded. I held my ground. I'm making a decision for myself. For yourself? His laugh was bitter, mocking. That's rich. You've never cared about yourself before. Now, suddenly you're some kind of free spirit. What changed? Did Melissa get in your head with her nonsense? This isn't about Melissa, I said. It's about me. And your mother. She wanted me to keep living, Daniel. To do more than just survive for everyone else. I forgot that for a long time. I won't forget it anymore. His expression hardened. So what? You're just abandoning us. Abandoning your grandchildren? You think opening some vanity project makes up for turning your back on family? It's not vanity, I said, my voice rising for the first time. It's survival. It's dignity. It's the life I should have claimed years ago. We stood there in the living room, father and son, staring at each other like strangers. For the first time in his life, Daniel looked at me and saw someone he couldn't control. You know what? He said finally, his voice cold. If this is how you want it, fine. But don't expect us to come running when it falls apart. Don't expect us to be around when you realize you're alone. The words were a threat, meant to scare me back into line. But instead of fear, I felt something else. Clarity. I've been alone for years, Daniel, I said softly, even with you in my life. At least now the solitude will be mine, not the emptiness left over after giving everything away. For a moment, I thought he might strike me. His fists clenched, his jaw worked. But then he turned, storming toward the door. He yanked it open, then spun back to glare at me. You'll regret this, Dad. The door slammed behind him, rattling the walls. The house shook with the force of it, but I didn't. I stood rooted in place, my breath steady, my hands still. For years I had feared losing Daniel's approval. Now I realized I had never truly had it. What I had was his dependence, his convenience, and I was done being convenient. I walked back to the kitchen table and sat down between the two notebooks again. For the first time, the debt book didn't feel like a chain. The sketchbook didn't feel like a relic. They felt like anchors, holding me steady against the storm. And as the afternoon light poured through the window, I knew this wasn't just about refusing Daniel. It was about claiming something bigger, the right to live before it was too late. The silence after Daniel slammed the door was thick and heavy, like smoke after a fire. I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where he'd stood, his face still etched in my mind. The anger, the disbelief, the contempt. For a long while I didn't move. My hands rested flat on the table between the two books. Debts and dreams. The house creaked around me, the furnace kicking on with a low groan, the clock ticking too loudly on the wall. Daniel's parting words echoed in the quiet. "You'll regret this, Dad." But the strange thing was, I didn't feel regret. I felt hollowed out, yes, raw and exhausted. But underneath it all, I felt steady. Still, the emptiness pressed in. He had threatened to cut me off, to abandon me. And though I told myself I'd been alone for years, the thought of losing even that fractured connection to him gnawed at me. The phone rang again. For a moment, I thought it would be Daniel returning to throw more barbs at me. I almost didn't answer. But when I picked it up, a familiar voice greeted me. "Luke?" "It's Henry Wallace Henry, my old friend from the hospital. We'd worked shifts together for nearly 20 years, trading jokes in the break room, covering for each other when one of us needed a breather. After retirement, we'd kept in touch, but not as often as we should have." "Henry," I said, my voice cracking with more relief than I expected. "Good to hear your voice." He chuckled warmly. "You too, old man. Listen, I ran into Melissa at the grocery store this morning. She wasn't exactly whispering. Said you've gone off the rails, refusing to watch the kids anymore. What's going on?" I sighed, rubbing my temple. "I finally told them no. I couldn't keep giving up my life for theirs. I think I might have lost them over it." There was a pause, then Henry's laugh. Not mocking, but approving. "About damn time." His words startled me. "What do you mean?" "Luke, you've been bending over backward for that boy since he was in diapers. Hell, I remember you selling your fishing gear to pay his tuition bill. You've been everybody's safety net for so long. I'm surprised it didn't snap sooner. Good on you for finally drawing a line." A lump rose in my throat. "They don't see it that way." Daniel said I'd regret it. "Melissa called me selfish. They think I've lost my mind." Henry snorted. "Selfish? You? Luke Carter, the man who never said no? The man who worked doubles so other people could make it to their kids' recitals? If anyone's earned the right to be selfish, it's you. And for the record, it ain't selfish. It's survival." His words loosened something inside me. For years, I'd carried this shame alone, believing that maybe I really was unreasonable to want anything for myself. Hearing Henry say it so plainly, it was like a window, cracking open in a suffocating room. I told him about the notebooks, about Marjorie's sketchbook, about the storefront downtown, the gallery dream that both thrilled and terrified me. When I finished, Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Luke, that sounds like the best damn idea you've ever had." I let out a shaky laugh. "You really think so?" "I know so. Marjorie would have loved it. She always wanted you to paint. And you've still got it in you, I bet. You just need someone to remind you." The tears threatened again, but this time they weren't bitter. They were lighter, gentler, like rain washing dust off an old window. "Henry," I said softly, "thank you." "Don't thank me," he replied. "Thank yourself for finally waking up. Listen, when you go look at that space, I'll come with you. You don't have to do this alone." I blinked at the phone in disbelief. "You'd do that?" "Of course. You spent your whole life showing up for others. It's about time someone showed up for you." We talked a while longer, reminiscing about the old days at the hospital, swapping memories that felt like lifelines. By the time I hung up, the heaviness in my chest had eased. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the house grew dim, I sat at the kitchen table again with the two notebooks. Only now, they didn't feel like adversaries. They felt like tools, one to remind me of where I'd been, the other to guide me toward where I needed to go. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel completely alone. Henry's words echoed in my ears. "It's about time someone showed up for you." I glanced at Marjorie's sketchbook, at the crimson leaf tucked inside. I touched it gently, my heart steady. Maybe Daniel and Melissa would never understand. Maybe they'd keep their distance. Maybe they'd cut me off. But that didn't mean I was without family. Sometimes family isn't who demands the most from you. Sometimes it's who stands beside you when you finally choose yourself. And in Henry's voice, I heard the truth. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I never thought I'd see the day. The gallery wasn't grand, not the sleek white-walled spaces you see in cities, not the kind of place where critics hover with champagne flutes and mutter about brushstrokes. No, mine was smaller, humbler. A narrow room with polished hardwood floors. Henry and I had sanded ourselves, freshly painted walls that still smelled faintly of eggshell enamel, and sunlight streaming in through wide front windows, cleaned so thoroughly you could see the street reflected like glass water. But to me, it was a cathedral. I stood in the center of the room that morning, heart hammering, hands trembling. Marjorie's sketchbook sat on a table near the entrance, open to the first page she'd ever given me. Don't ever stop painting. Her words had become my compass. Around the room hung canvases that felt like fragments of my soul stitched back together. The maple tree blazing red in autumn, a portrait of Marjorie's scarf, folded the way she used to wear it, even Clara and Jacob, sketched from memory, their laughter captured in brush strokes I hadn't thought my hands could still make. The door was propped open, a small sign outside reading, Carter Gallery. Opening today. Henry bustled in from the back, wiping his hands on a rag. You look like you're about to pass out, he said with a grin. I feel like I might, I admitted. My knees shook, my chest tight. What if nobody comes? He clapped me on the shoulder. Then you'll have the finest private gallery in town. But trust me, someone will come. People always notice when something new blooms on Main Street. He was right. It started slowly at first. A woman from the cafe down the block poked her head in, then stepped fully inside. A young couple paused at the window, then wandered in to look. Soon a trickle became a stream. Strangers filled the room, their voices low but curious, their eyes lingering on the canvases. I stood off to the side, wringing my hands, afraid to interrupt their viewing. But when a boy stopped in front of the maple tree painting and whispered to his mother, "It looks like fire," my throat tightened. That was exactly how Marjorie had described it all those years ago. People nodded, smiled, asked quiet questions. Some even bought small pieces, sketches I'd tucked into frames, never thinking they'd matter to anyone else. With each purchase, my chest swelled with something I hadn't felt in decades. Pride. But amid the joy, there was an empty space I couldn't ignore. Daniel and Melissa weren't there. I hadn't expected them, not really. Still, part of me had hoped. Hoped they'd walk in, see the walls filled with my work, realize that I wasn't just a convenience to be summoned and dismissed. But the door never opened for them. Instead, Henry stood beside me, his grin wide. "Look at you," he said. "You did it." I swallowed hard, my eyes burning. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Nonsense," he said. "I just reminded you of what you already had in you." By afternoon, the gallery was buzzing. The local paper had sent a reporter, snapping pictures, asking about my artistic journey. I stumbled over my words, feeling foolish, but when I told them about Marjorie, about the promise I had broken and finally reclaimed, they nodded solemnly. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light through the windows, I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The street was busy, people carrying shopping bags, kids tugging at their parents' hands. I leaned against the brick wall, heart still racing, but this time from exhilaration rather than fear. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, not as a father, not as a babysitter, not as a man past his prime, but as Luke Carter, a man with something of his own. When I stepped back inside, a little girl was staring at the portrait of Clara and Jacob. She turned to me and said shyly, "They look happy." "They are," I said softly. And in that moment, I realized something. Even if Daniel and Melissa never forgave me, even if they kept their distance, I hadn't lost everything. I still had the memories, still had love for my grandchildren, and maybe someday when they were older, they'd walk into this gallery themselves and see who their grandfather really was. As the last visitors trickled out and the day wound down, Henry locked the door and turned to me. "So how does it feel?" I looked around the room, at the walls lined with color, at the sketchbook on the table, at the sunlight still clinging to the edges of the glass. "It feels," I said slowly, "like I've finally kept my promise." And I knew, deep down, that Marjorie was there with me, not in body but in spirit, in every brushstroke, in every heartbeat of that gallery. Opening day wasn't just about art, it was about resurrection. The morning after the gallery's opening, I woke before dawn. For years, waking early had meant exhaustion, another double shift, another list of demands waiting for me. But this morning felt different. The house was quiet, still cloaked in shadow, but instead of emptiness, I felt something stir inside me, a quiet hum, like the first note of a song I'd almost forgotten. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The 2 notebooks were still there, where they had been for weeks. The debt book, its pages filled with sacrifices, numbers etched in ink that told the story of what I had given away, and Marjorie's sketchbook, filled with unfinished dreams, now tucked with new pages. Sketches of the gallery itself, scribbles from my trembling hands late at night as I planned the walls, the windows, the light. I ran my fingers over both covers. Once they had felt like shackles. Now they felt like companions, reminders of where I had been and where I had finally chosen to go. The phone was silent, no calls from Daniel, no texts from Melissa. Their absence was loud but no longer crushing. I missed Clara and Jacob, of course I did, but I told myself the truth I had avoided for too long. Love doesn't mean servitude, and someday when my grandchildren are old enough to ask questions, maybe they'll come find me. Maybe they'll step into the gallery and see me for who I am. I carried my coffee to the window and looked out at the maple tree. Most of its leaves had fallen now, carpeting the ground in shades of crimson and gold. The branches were bare, skeletal, reaching toward the pale morning sky. To some, it would look like loss. To me, it looked like renewal. The tree wasn't dead. It was resting, waiting, preparing for the bloom to come. And I thought, that's me. For decades, I had been stripped bare, season after season, giving everything until there was nothing left. But I hadn't died. I'd only been waiting for the right season to bloom again. Later that day, I walked to the gallery. The Carter Gallery sign still hung proudly in the window. Inside, the sunlight spilled across the paintings. The smell of fresh paint and varnish mingled in the air. Henry was already there, tinkering with a loose hinge on the back door. "Morning, Luke," he said with a grin. "You're here early." I smiled. "Couldn't sleep. Too much to think about." He chuckled. "That's a good sign. Means you've got something worth thinking about." As he worked, I wandered the room, letting my eyes settle on each piece. My hand brushed the maple tree canvas, the one I had left unfinished all those years ago. Now it was complete. Every branch, every leaf, every flicker of color filled in. I had signed it at the bottom corner in careful strokes. Luke Carter. For years my name had been missing. On bills, on sacrifices, on debts, I had been invisible. But here on canvas my name stood clear. The doorbell jingled and a woman stepped in. She was older, with silver hair pulled into a bun, her coat buttoned neatly. She wandered the gallery slowly, her eyes wide. She stopped in front of the maple tree painting and stayed there a long while. Finally she turned to me. "Did you paint this?" "Yes," I said softly. "It feels alive," she whispered, "like it's burning, but beautifully." Her words pierced me in the best way. I thought of Marjorie sitting under that tree, sunlight in her hair. I thought of the years I had buried that vision. And now, here it was, alive again, not just for me, but for others. The woman bought the painting. When I wrapped it for her, my hands trembled. Part of me ached to let it go, but another part understood. Sharing it was the point. I had given away so much in my life unwillingly. This finally was something I could give freely. When she left, I stood in the quiet gallery, my heart swelling. I didn't need Daniel's approval. I didn't need Melissa's validation. What I needed was this, the chance to live, to create, to honor Marjorie, and to honor myself. As the afternoon sun slanted across the floorboards, I whispered aloud, "I kept my promise, Marjorie." The words hung in the light like prayer. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Daniel might never forgive me. Melissa might keep poisoning his ear. I might lose years with Clara and Jacob. That grief was real. But so was this freedom, and freedom once claimed could not be taken back. I walked to the door, flipped the sign to open, and stood tall as the first customers of the afternoon strolled in. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just existing, I was living, and that, I realized, was enough.